In the chaos of WWII's final months, a German colonel pulled off the impossible, capturing 50,000 gallons of precious American fuel. But as he looked out over the endless Allied convoys, a chilling realization set in. Germany was doomed, not by the enemy's guns, but by their bottomless supply lines. This is the true story of how one moment of victory revealed the scale of inevitable defeat. In the final, desperate months of World War II, the German war machine was running on fumes literally. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe in a storm of steel and fire, now found itself crippled by a single, inescapable truth: without fuel, even the best army in the world cannot fight. As Allied forces surged across France and into the heart of Germany, the Third Reich's fate was sealed not just by the enemy's guns, but by the relentless, unstoppable flow of American gasoline. But for one German colonel, the reality of defeat did not come with a bullet or a bomb. It came with a moment of triumph: a daring raid, a captured convoy, and 50,000 gallons of precious American fuel. In that instant, as he surveyed the endless Allied supply lines stretching to the horizon, he realized the war was lost. This is the story of how a single victory revealed the scale of inevitable defeat. The story begins in the winter of 1944. As the German army launched its last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's gamble was simple: punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, seize the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. The plan was bold, but it was built on a foundation of hope and desperation. The German army was short on everything: men, tanks, ammunition, but most of all, it was short on fuel. For months, the Wehrmacht had been scraping the bottom of the barrel. Synthetic fuel plants bombed to rubble, oil fields lost in Romania, and supply lines choked by Allied power. Every drop of gasoline was precious, every barrel a matter of life and death. Tanks were hidden in forests, waiting for enough fuel to move. Trucks were cannibalized for parts. Soldiers marched on foot, their vehicles abandoned for lack of petrol. Yet, in the chaos of the Ardennes, opportunity beckoned. The Americans, confident and advancing, had pushed their supply lines to the limit. Convoys of trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food snaked through the narrow roads of Belgium and Luxembourg. For the Germans, these convoys were a lifeline and a target. Colonel Hans Richter was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man hardened by years of war. He had seen victory and defeat, hope and despair. Now, as commander of a Kampfgruppe battle group of tanks, infantry, and armored cars, he was tasked with a simple but vital mission: capture Allied fuel, or die trying. Richter's orders were clear. His unit was to break through the American lines, seize a supply depot, and bring back as much fuel as possible. The plan was risky, but the rewards were immense. With enough gasoline, his tanks could keep moving, his men could keep fighting, and the offensive might yet succeed. The attack began before dawn. Under cover of darkness and fog, Richter's column moved out, panthers and half-tracks rumbling down icy roads, infantry riding on the decks, machine guns at the ready. The Americans, caught off guard, fought back fiercely. There were firefights in the villages, ambushes in the forests, and desperate charges across open fields. But Richter pressed on, driving his men forward with the promise of fuel and survival. By midday, the Kampfgruppe reached its objective, a small town where an American supply convoy had been halted by a blown bridge. Dozens of trucks, loaded with fuel barrels, sat abandoned in the snow. The drivers had fled or been captured, and the road was littered with the wreckage of battle. For Richter and his men, It was a miracle. They quickly set to work, siphoning gasoline from the trucks, filling every tank, can, and jerrycan they could find. The air was thick with the smell of petrol and the shouts of triumphant soldiers. In all, they captured nearly 50,000 gallons of American fuel, a treasure beyond price. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like victory. The tanks roared to life, engines revving, treads churning through the snow. The men cheered, their spirits lifted by the promise of movement, of hope, of one more chance to turn the tide. But as Richter stood atop a captured truck, surveying the scene, a different feeling crept in. He looked out over the endless rows of fuel barrels, the lines of American trucks stretching back toward the west, and the realization hit him like a blow. This was just one convoy, one depot, one drop in an ocean of Allied supply. He thought of the stories he'd heard of American convoys stretching for miles, of fuel trains arriving day and night, of depots so vast they seemed to have no end. He remembered the reports from the front, American tanks refueled in the field, trucks arriving with fresh supplies even as the battle raged. He knew, in that moment, that Germany could never match this, no matter how many convoys they captured. No matter how many barrels they seized, it would never be enough. Richter's men celebrated. But he felt only a cold, sinking certainty. The war was lost not because the Germans lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked the means to fight. The Americans, with their endless fuel, their tireless convoys, and their unbreakable supply lines, had already won. That night, as the Kampfruck prepared to move out, Richter wrote in his diary, "We have captured the enemy's fuel, but it is like stealing a cup of water from a river. Their supply is endless. Ours is gone. I fear we are finished." The next day, the Kampfruck pushed forward, tanks fueled and spirits high. But the victory was short-lived. The Americans regrouped, counterattacked, and the battle raged anew. The captured fuel was soon spent. The tanks once again stranded, and the dream of victory faded into the winter mist. For Colonel Richter, the lesson was clear. The true power of the Allies was not just in their weapons or their numbers, but in their ability to supply, to sustain, and to endure. The war would be decided not on the battlefield, but on the roads and rails, in the depots and convoys, and the endless flow of fuel that kept the American army moving. The story of Colonel Hans Richter's raid spread quickly through the German ranks. For a brief moment, it was celebrated as a rare success, a daring strike that had outwitted the Americans and brought home a prize that every unit desperately needed. But as the days passed and the fuel was burned away, in a few short advances, the mood shifted. The men who had cheered as their tanks rolled out now found themselves stranded once more, engines silent, hope slipping away with every empty barrel. Richter's realization was not unique. Across the Western Front, German officers and soldiers alike were coming to the same grim conclusion. The Reich's war machine, once the envy of the world, was now a shadow of its former self. The reasons were many: Allied bombing campaigns that had shattered Germany's synthetic fuel plants, the loss of the Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, and the relentless pressure of the Red Army in the east. But above all, it was the sheer scale of Allied logistics that made defeat inevitable. The Americans, it seemed, had mastered the art of supply. Their convoys stretched for miles. Their depots overflowed with fuel, food, and ammunition. Trains arrived day and night, unloading endless streams of materiel. Airfields were built in days, roads repaired in hours, and every soldier seemed to have what he needed, when he needed it. For the Germans, who had grown used to making do with less, it was both awe-inspiring and demoralizing. Richter's own experience became a symbol of this new reality. He watched as his men tried to ration the captured fuel, eking out every last drop. They siphoned tanks, shared jerrycans, and even tried to distill fuel from whatever scraps they could find. But it was never enough. The tanks that had roared to life after the raid soon ground to a halt, their engines coughing and dying in the cold. Trucks were abandoned, guns left behind, and the Kampfrupp was forced to retreat on foot. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed unstoppable. Their supply lines were a marvel of organization and efficiency, the Red Ball Express. A convoy system created to keep Patton's tanks moving, became legendary, day and night. Trucks thundered down the roads, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food to the front. When bridges were blown, engineers built new ones in hours. When roads turned to mud, bulldozers and graders kept the convoys rolling. The scale was staggering by the end of the war. The U.S. Army had delivered over 3.5 billion gallons of fuel to the European theater. For Richter, the contrast was painful. He remembered the early days of the war, when German panzers had swept across France in a lightning blitzkrieg, fueled by carefully planned supply lines and the element of surprise. Now, those same panzers sat idle, their crews huddled around campfires, waiting for a miracle that would never come. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had once believed in victory now spoke in whispers of defeat. Officers who had prided themselves on their resourcefulness now found themselves powerless in the face of Allied abundance. Even the most die-hard Nazis could not ignore the evidence before their eyes. The war was lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the warehouses, the rail yards, and the endless convoys that kept the American army moving. Richter's diary, once filled with plans and strategies, became a record of despair. He wrote of the frustration of watching his men struggle, of the bitterness of seeing American trucks roll by, their tanks full and their crews confident. He wrote of the shame he felt, knowing that all his skill and courage could not change the outcome. "We are defeated by their supply," he wrote, "not by their guns, but by their gasoline." The impact of Allied logistics was felt far beyond the front lines. German civilians, too. So the difference. As the Allies advanced, they brought with them not just soldiers, but supplies, food, medicine, and fuel. For many Germans, the sight of American convoys was both a relief and a humiliation. It was a reminder of what had been lost, and of the power that now lay in the hands of the enemy. The German High Command, desperate to turn the tide, launched a series of counterattacks. But each one faltered for lack of fuel. Tanks ran dry before reaching their objectives, trucks broke down, and soldiers were forced to abandon their weapons and retreat. The dream of a final victory, of a miracle that would save the Reich, faded with every passing day. For Colonel Richter, the end came quietly. His Kampfrupp, once a proud and powerful unit, was reduced to a handful of men, their weapons useless, their spirits broken. They surrendered to the Americans in a small village. Their last act one of resignation rather than defiance. Richter handed over his pistol, saluted his captors, and walked into captivity with the knowledge that he had done all he could. In the prison camp, Richter found himself among thousands of other German officers and soldiers, all grappling with the same questions. How had it come to this? Where had it all gone wrong? The answers, he knew, were complex. But one truth stood out above all others. The Allies had won not just with their armies, but with their ability to supply, to sustain, and to endure. As the war drew to a close, Richter reflected on the lessons he had learned. He thought of the raid, the captured fuel, and the moment of realization that had changed everything. He thought of the endless American convoys, the mountains of supplies, and the quiet efficiency that had made victory possible. And he understood, at last, that the true power of an army lies not just in its weapons, but in its ability to keep fighting, no matter the odds. As the spring of 1945 approached, the collapse of the German war effort became impossible to ignore. The Allies pressed forward on all fronts, their advance fueled by a logistical machine that seemed to have no limits. For Colonel Hans, Richter, and countless other German officers, the memory of that captured American fuel convoy lingered, a bitter reminder of how fleeting even the greatest tactical victories could be when set against the industrial might of the United States. In the prison camp, Richter found himself surrounded by men from every branch of the German military. Some were still defiant, clinging to rumors of secret weapons or last-minute miracles, but most, like Richter, had seen enough to know the truth. They spoke quietly of the endless American supply lines, the convoys that never stopped, the skies filled with Allied planes. They remembered the day when, for a few hours, they had tasted victory only to watch it slip away as the fuel ran out and the Americans returned, stronger than ever. The American guards at the camp were mostly young men, friendly but firm. They brought food, cigarettes, and sometimes even news from the outside world. For the German prisoners, the abundance of supplies was a daily shock. Meals were simple but plentiful: bread, meat, potatoes, and coffee. There was enough for everyone, every day. It was a stark contrast to the rationing and hunger that had become the norm in Germany. Richter often sat with his fellow officers, watching the American supply trucks roll past the camp. He marveled at the efficiency, the organization, the sheer scale of it all. He thought back to the raid, to the barrels of fuel that had seemed like a miracle, and realized how small it all was compared to the vast resources at the Allies' disposal. The prisoners talked about the war, about what they had seen and done. Some shared stories of bravery and sacrifice, others of loss and regret. But again and again, the conversation returned to logistics, to the fuel, the food, the ammunition that had kept the American army moving while the German war machine ground to a halt. One day, an American officer visited the camp to speak with the senior German officers. He explained how the U.S. Army had built its supply lines, how convoys were organized, how depots were stocked and restocked with clockwork precision. He spoke of the Red Ball Express, of the engineers who built bridges overnight, of the planners who made sure every unit had what it needed. Richter listened in silence, taking it all in. He realized that the true genius of the American war effort was not just in its technology or its manpower, but in its ability to deliver day after day, mile after mile. No matter the obstacles, as the weeks passed, news of Germany's defeat became impossible to ignore. The Allies crossed the Rhine, Berlin was surrounded, and the Nazi regime crumbled. In the camp, the mood was somber. Some men wept, others stared into the distance, lost in thought. Richter felt a strange sense of relief. The war was over, the suffering, the hunger, the endless struggle for fuel and supplies, it was all coming to an end. In the final days before Germany's surrender, Richter wrote one last entry in his diary. "We fought as best we could, but we were defeated by more than just soldiers. We were defeated by trains and trucks, by barrels of gasoline and crates of food. The Americans fought with abundance, and in the end, that was a weapon we could not match." After the war, Richter and many of his fellow officers were interrogated by Allied intelligence. They were asked about tactics, about battles, about the inner workings of the German army. But again and again, the conversation turned to logistics. The Americans wanted to know how the Germans had tried to keep their armies supplied, how they had coped with shortages, how they had planned their offensives with so little fuel. Richter answered honestly. He described the desperate measures, the raids, the rationing, the endless improvisation. He spoke of the day his unit captured the American fuel convoy, and how, in that moment, he realized the war was lost. The interrogators listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions. They understood, as Richter did, that the true story of the war was not just one of battles and generals, but of supply lines and logistics. As the months turned into years, Richter was eventually released from captivity. He returned to a Germany in ruins, a country struggling to rebuild from the ashes of war. He found work as an engineer, using the skills he had learned in the army to help reconstruct roads, bridges, and factories. He never forgot the lessons of the war, the importance of planning, of preparation, of making sure that every man had what he needed to do his job. In time, Richter wrote a memoir, sharing his experiences with a new generation. He told the story of the raid, of the captured fuel, and of the moment when he realized that Germany was doomed. He wrote of the power of logistics, of the way that abundance could be as decisive as any weapon. His book became required reading for military students, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the enemy's ability to supply and sustain its forces. The story of Colonel Hans Richter and the captured fuel convoy became a legend among historians. It was cited in studies of the war, discussed in classrooms, and remembered by those who understood that victory is often decided not by the clash of armies, but by the quiet, relentless work of those who keep the wheels turning. In the years after the war, the lessons of logistics and supply became central to how military leaders and historians understood the outcome of World War II. The story of Colonel Hans Richter's raid and his moment of realization was retold in staff colleges and war colleges, not just in Germany, but around the world. It became a parable about the limits of courage and tactics when faced with the overwhelming power of industrial production and organization. For Richter, life in post-war Germany was a daily reminder of what had been lost and what had been learned. The cities were scarred, the people weary, but there was also a sense of determination to rebuild. He found work helping to reconstruct the very infrastructure that had been destroyed: roads, bridges, and railways. In every project, he saw echoes of the war, the importance of moving goods, of keeping lines open, of never underestimating the value of a steady supply. He kept in touch with some of his former comrades, men who had also survived the war and captivity. They met occasionally in small gatherings, sharing stories and memories, sometimes laughing, sometimes falling silent as the weight of the past pressed in. The story of the captured fuel convoy was always a topic of conversation. Some remembered it as a moment of hope, others as the instant they knew the end was near. Richter's memoir, published a decade after the war, was both a confession and a warning. He wrote candidly about the failures of the German High Command, the arrogance that had led them to underestimate the Allies, and the blindness to the realities of modern warfare. He described the day his unit captured the American fuel, the brief surge of triumph, and the cold certainty that followed. "We had won a battle," he wrote, "but in that victory, I saw the shape of our defeat. The Americans could lose 1,000 barrels and not notice. We could not lose a single one without disaster." His words resonated with readers, especially those who had lived through the war. For many Germans, The story was a painful reminder of the cost of hubris and the importance of humility. For Allied readers, it was a testament to the power of preparation, planning, and the quiet heroism of those who worked behind the scenes to keep the armies moving. As the decades passed, the world changed, Germany rebuilt, Europe united, and the old enemies became partners in peace, but the lessons of the war endured. Military planners studied the logistics of the Allied campaigns, seeking to understand how vast armies could be supplied across oceans and continents. The Red Bull Express, the endless convoys. The engineers who built bridges over untold became models for future operations. Richter lived to see a new Germany, prosperous and peaceful, its roads and railways humming with commerce instead of war. He took pride in his work and the small part he played in rebuilding his country. But he never forgot the winter of 1944, the raid on the American convoy, and the moment when he understood that the war was lost not by the failure of arms, but by the triumph of supply. In his final years, Richter was sometimes invited to speak to students and young officers. He would tell them the story of the captured fuel, of the hope and despair that followed, and of the lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life. Wars are not won by heroes alone, he would say. They are won by those who plan, who prepare, who make sure that every man has what he needs when he needs it. Never forget the power of a full barrel, a loaded truck, a steady convoy. In the end, that is what decides the fate of nations. The story of Colonel Hans Richter and the 50,000 gallons of American fuel became more than just a tale of war. It became a lesson for all who would lead, who would fight, who would dream of victory. It was a reminder that in the great struggles of history, the quiet work of supply and support is as vital as the clash of armies and the courage of soldiers. As the sun set on his life, Richter found peace in the knowledge that he had learned from his defeat, that he had helped to rebuild what had been broken, and that his story might help others avoid the mistakes of the past. The memory of that winter morning, the barrels of fuel, and the realization that changed everything, remained with him always a symbol of the truth that, in war as in life, it is often the unseen, the unheralded, and the unglamorous that make all the difference. And so, the legend of the German colonel who captured 50,000 gallons of US fuel and realized Germany was doomed endures not just as a story of loss, but as a testament to the enduring power of logistics, the humility of experience, and the hope that comes from learning, rebuilding, and moving forward. If this story changed the way you see World War II, hit like and subscribe for more untold moments from history. What do you think was the real turning point in the war? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow history fans. Thanks for watching.